Welcome to Baker Dave Presents. We're here once again in the kitchen at Johnson & Hardwick Hall on Temple University's campus. It's a working kitchen. You're going to hear some noises. There might be some people that walk by. Today, I'm doing an episode all by myself, a solo episode. And I decided I wanted to bring a recipe I've been wanting to bring for a long time. It's my world famous Stollen recipe. However, Stollen is extremely difficult and very involved to make, so I decided to turn it into a cookie. So I'm going to make a Stollen cookie recipe coming right up. Welcome. So today we're going to talk about traditions. Here at Temple University, this school has been here for a very long time, and there's tons of traditions that happen here. I myself have brought several traditions here. One of the things that we do is we have a Temple tea cookie. It was a cookie that was actually voted on by the students several years ago. I went and I made 3 or 4 different types of cookies, went around, had all the students taste them, had them vote on them, and they picked the one that they liked best, and that's become the official Temple cookie. It's a delicious red velvet cookie with some cream cheese on top, shaped in the letter of T for Temple. There's a giant cake. Every year we do a gigantic cake that feeds 5,000 people. This is like the 7th or 8th year probably coming up. Another wonderful tradition that I think I've helped to install here at the university. I hope that it lasts well after I'm gone. It's been super cool doing those cakes. Especially because it involves the students. It's not just me. So I actually have, there'll usually be like 20, 25 students that'll volunteer. They'll actually come in, they'll help bake the cake, they'll help ice the cake, they'll help put the cake together. It's like a whole process. And as I said, I hope that tradition lasts for millennia. I hope that great-grandchildren talking about the awesome big cake that Baker Dave started. And another tradition that I do here at Temple University is every holiday season, I make Stollen, which is a German Christmas bread. I make the Stollen, and the thing about it is that I have to start the process of making the Stollen in September. So in September, I'll actually procure my dried fruits, I'll get my raisins together and my cherries and dates and whatever it is I'm going to use that year. And I'm going to get bottles and bottles of rum, and I'm going to soak that fruit for literally like 2 or 3 months. I'm going to take a big mound of granulated sugar, and I'm going to shove vanilla beans into the sugar and then wrap that up and set that aside for months so that it infuses the flavor of the vanilla and the sugar. So it's a very tedious, long process. You couldn't call me up tomorrow and say, hey, I want a Stollen, and I would have it for you for the weekend. Even when I actually go to make the bread, it takes 3 days of actually in the preparation process after all the other stuff is ready. So for years now, I've thought, wouldn't it be great to do Stollen for the show? And it just doesn't, it's not gonna work. Like, doing bread is hard enough, but doing a bread that takes 3 months and trying to make it fit into a 20-minute show is just not gonna happen. So what I did is I decided, how about I come up with a cookie? So I actually created this cookie specifically with the Stollen flavors that I use for my Stollen. Now keep in mind, Stollen is, like I said, it's a Christmas bread. I always tell the same story. I don't even know if it's true. I'm not gonna lie. It may not even be true. But the story I tell, because I feel like it makes sense, is that Stollen, I believe, comes from the idea that peasants years ago would have tried to snag a peach or a pear or a plum or whatever off of somebody's tree down the street, saved it aside. When wintertime comes, right, they're starting to dry out or whatever, and they would actually use those in the bread, hence the name Stollen. I actually looked this up and couldn't find anybody else that thought this name, but I'm pretty sure that's the actual story, so I'm going to go with that. So the thing about Stollen is that there's several different kinds. If you go to Germany, it's like every region has their own version of Stollen. The one I'm making now, I couldn't even tell you what region it's from, but it involves a lot of dried fruit and the rum and a lot of those flavors, spices. There's other flavors that will actually use almond paste. There's others that use whole almonds in it, sliced almonds. There's lots of different choices here. But this is my Stollen. This is the Temple University official Stollen that we make every year and give out as gifts. The most important part about Stollen, we're going to get ready to start making this in a minute, but the most important part is the spice mixture. I actually remember, so I'm in culinary school, right? And our our pastry chef that was in charge of the class, he's German. And he was all happy about this Stollen recipe, and he had us all make it Stollen at the holiday season. And we're all mixing up this recipe they wrote on the board, and he didn't put the spices on there. And I'm like, well, you know, where's the rest of it? Oh, no, I'll come around, I'll put the spices in when it's time. And he would come around and actually add a couple tablespoons of spice to your particular mix. We weren't allowed to know what the spices were, which I think is a crock because I'm paying how many dollars, you know, to go to school here, and this guy's not even going to show me a recipe for real. So years later, I had to come up with my own version of what I believe the spices were based on what they were then. One of the key spices that you find in a lot of Stollens is cardamom, not something you usually see out there. So we're going to start by making the spice mixture. And I actually make this in a much bigger amount, and then I'll set it aside and I'll use it for other things. I'll flavor bread pudding with it, or it becomes my Stollen spice, right? And what we're going to do is we're going to start, and that's why the recipe itself is based on parts. So I'm going to tell it to you in parts. So it doesn't matter what you use. If you want to make a cup of each of these ingredients and make a gigantic batch, by all means. I used teaspoons for this particular recipe. So I have 2 parts cinnamon that I'm going to add in there. I have 1 part nutmeg, 1 part ginger, 1 part clove, a half a part of cardamom, and then I do 2 parts orange zest. Got to get all that in there. And 2 parts lemon zest. So we start with this beautiful mixture. We mix that up, and then we're going to measure out of that. So when you get to the actual, we're going to set this aside. Get to the actual recipe, we're going to put 2 teaspoons or 2 tablespoons of this mixture into the recipe. And this way, like I said, if you want to, you know, if you're real secretive about your recipes, by all means, sit this in a jar somewhere and tell everybody that they can't have the recipe for the spice, and give them the recipe for everything else, and they can think that, you know, you're special. I guess, I don't know. So we're going to set that aside. Now we're going to start the cookie part of the recipe. For this, it's a fairly simple, almost like a shortbread. We're going to use 8 ounces of butter. We're going to use a cup of sugar, a 1/4 teaspoon of baking powder. That's just to make it a little bit lighter. And this is, again, one of those things where when I write recipes, I don't ever bother putting directions on what to do for the recipe, which annoys a lot of people. So if you ask for my recipes, I'll give anybody my recipe, but you're going to have to also ask me how to make it, because I know all cookies are mixed the same way, all brownies are mixed the same way, all cakes are mixed the same way. So to me, there's only 4 or 5 mixing methods, and they all fall into that category. So what we're doing right now is we're actually creaming the butter with the sugar. So if you have a machine, or I'm doing it by hand because I use soft butter, and that's what I always do here, right? But the idea is that the sugar itself is going to act like sandpaper and cut through the butter, which is super cool. So if you have cold butter, it'll actually still cut through the butter. The funny thing about this recipe too is I never had Stollen growing up. I do have a little German heritage, but I never had Stollen growing up. We had Hungarian cookies. We had this crisscross cake that my grandmother would make. Never had Stollen though. It wasn't until after I experienced it here, moving to the East Coast, that I fell in love with the idea of it. Because who likes fruitcake for real? Like, nobody likes fruitcake, right? And that's the gift that you keep giving and giving to other people. This is amazing fruitcake, but it's not really cake. It's more like a bread. So when you give this to somebody and they turn their nose up at it, make sure that they get a chance to try it, because it's going to be worth it. And then we're actually going to add an egg, because that's how you make cookies. You do the creaming, the sugar stuff, you add your eggs, and then you add your flour last, okay? And that's when it's all going to come together and actually start looking more like a cookie, because at this point, it's just going to look like a bit of a mess. You know what I mean? Which is fine. One thing they always tell you in recipes, which I can't disagree with, because they're probably right, you should keep your eggs room temperature. And the main reason to do that, as you see mine right here, my butter still looks like butter. If your eggs are cold, it'll start setting the butter back up, which you don't want. And a lot of times it comes out almost cottage cheesy, which, again, you don't want. We have 3 cups of flour. And then, like I said, this is actually going to start turning into a cookie at this point. As a child, I remember at Christmas time, my biggest question was how does Santa get into the house, right? Because we didn't have a chimney. I only lived in a 1-story house. And I don't remember how this whole story went down, but I do remember there was a time that I guess I was on the verge of not believing. It was one of those type of deals. And I'm like telling my parents that there's no way Santa can't even get into our house. We don't even have a chimney. Like, I don't understand what's going on. And all of a sudden Santa shows up at the door, right? And brings gifts or does whatever. And I actually witnessed all this. I was there. And of course, I immediately was like, Dad, seriously, this is a joke. Like, get out of the Santa costume. I know it's you, blah, blah, blah. Then my dad walks in from the other room. I find out later it was a friend of theirs that they ended up having do it. But I think it's great trying to keep those traditions alive, like having your children believe as long as they can. You know what I mean? And if there are any children watching this, Santa's 100% real. I just want to make that clear right now. Whatever you just heard right now when I was talking, that was nonsense. Totally real, okay? And he loves Stollen. Loves Stollen and brings Stollen to all the good boys. All the bad boys and girls, they get fruitcake. The good boys and girls, they get Stollen. So the cookie we're making, the great thing about that is that this is your opportunity to have the flavors of Stollen any time of the year because you don't have to go through that long process. So we have our dough, and as you can see, it kind of comes together, much like any cookie dough. Now we want the flavors of rum. We don't necessarily have rum around the house. I'm not a heavy drinker. So I'm going to use a rum extract. I'm just going to add a tablespoon of rum extract to give that flavor. And then I have my dried fruit. Now, what's cool about this dried fruit, oftentimes I use candied fruit, and sometimes you can't find candied fruit, especially different times of the year when you want that flavors, which it's not that easy to find. I literally just picked up, there's a bag that has like mixed dried fruit. It'll have like apricot, pears, sometimes apples, dates, whatever, some raisins, some cranberries, chop them up real small. And then what I do to get them more moist is I actually make a simple syrup. So I can't do it now because I had to actually have it cool for this. What you do is you'll cook equal parts sugar and water, and that creates like a simple syrup. You'll put the fruit in there, and you'll boil that up so that it'll open the fruit up and actually absorb that moisture so that it'll be nice and moist. At that point, you can also throw a little rum flavor in there if you want, a little vanilla. You can do all sorts of stuff to infuse into this at that point. Let it sit overnight, it gets cold, and then drain off the liquid and you have your fruit. I got about a cup of chopped up fruit here that I'm gonna add. And then I have to do my spice mixture, right? So I have 2 tablespoons of the mixture we just made. And I'm going to continue and mix this all together. I can already smell it. This smells like what I think of as Christmas now. I wish as a child I would have had this more, I guess, because I'd have a better story of, how my great grandmother made it or something, but I still think the temple story is a great story. I mean, the idea that hopefully, like I said, this is something, maybe it's a reason that they have to keep me here forever, right? I mean, I guess I can never leave because they need their Stollen, right? So we've mixed it up, and you can see it's a little bit darker now because it actually has the spices really sticking to my hands a little bit, which is fine because the flour, when you roll it out, it's going to make up that. But we've got the spices in there. It's a little bit darker. It's got all the fruit in there. Like, it's starting to look like the Stollen bread looks when you're making it. We're going to take and throw a little flour down because now we're rolling it out, right? We're over here. And you want to keep this kind of thick. You don't want to roll it super thin. I'm going to say like 1/8 inch, 1/4 inch, somewhere around there. And we're going to cut circles out, right? Kind of a biscuit cutter. Let's say you don't have a biscuit cutter. Just take a cup or a glass at home. You can use that. The same idea. If you see Stollen, and this is why I do this, because it'll look like the Stollen, it's the bread, but like a mini loaf. That's the goal, right? So if you see Stollen, it typically has like this folded over look when it's done, which is what we're going to go for, which is why we're starting with a circle. But real simple. And the other great thing about Stollen, right? And actually I did look this up, so I'm not as crazy as it sounds. So Stollen originally, I think it was like a peasant type bread, but originally Stollen was made with oil and apparently wasn't that tasty. And somewhere in the Middle Ages or whatever, I think the German people actually tried to get the Pope to allow them to use butter because they weren't allowed to actually use butter at that point. They had to, during the Christmas season, they weren't allowed to use butter. They had to use only oil. And there was this whole thing, and I believe if you look back in history, it probably has a lot more to do with the fact that Rome is olive oil area and they wanted to sell more olive oil, to be honest. So they actually made a bunch of laws to prohibit the use of butter at a time. And they wanted their bread, but they had to make it with oil, and it wasn't as good. So they eventually petitioned the Pope to be able to get butter so that they could make their Stollen bread, which was super cool. He eventually allowed it, and then I think he charged them like a tariff or something. Like, if you're going to use butter, you got to pay this much, and so it was a win-win for everybody, right? So with the bread, you'll actually butter it before it goes in the oven, and you'll butter it again when it comes out of the oven. We're going to actually, and this is unlike any other cookie, but we're going to butter these cookies before they go in, and part of that is to help it to fold over. So we're going to do that fold over there, and there's going to be a little layer of butter there, which is kind of cool. But again, this took me several, I had to come up with some ideas to make this work, because usually you do not do this with cookies. You don't usually butter them before you stick them in the oven. So after we do get these all done, we're going to put them in the oven. And then we're going to actually create a vanilla sugar, and we're going to create a rum glaze, again with like a rum flavor at this point, so that the end result will be very similar to what you look like when you see the bread. You're going to get the crunch from the sugar, which is super cool. You're going to get the super butteriness, because I think they went crazy. I think they were like, dude, you're letting us use butter, so we're going to put butter everywhere. The bread itself has so much butter in it, it's not even funny. And then they butter it before it goes in, and then buttered. I've actually seen it where it gets buttered, then it gets proofed, then it gets buttered again, then it goes in the oven, then it gets buttered again, and then they put the sugar on it. It creates this crust, and then they usually powdered sugar at the top after that. I mean, it's insane the amount of butter. So if you're ever out there trying to purchase some Stollen and you're seeing that it's $50 for a loaf, because that's pretty much what it goes for nowadays, you'll know why. It's because there's a lot of butter in it, and butter is always expensive. It's like our steak of the bakery, you know what I mean? Like, steak is expensive, that's our one ingredient. So we're going to finish the top. We're going to butter this top part here because I need more butter. Like, you need more butter. We're not going to do it 4 times or whatever, because that seems ridiculous, but we are going to butter the whole thing like that. And then I'm going to go ahead and stick this in the oven, like I said, like a 350. Everything I bake is at 350, I'm not going to lie. Like puff pastry, maybe I'd go up to a 400, 425, or pâtisserie, but other than that, everything else is 350, because, like, why mess with that? Just change your times. It should take like 10, 15 minutes. It's a pretty quick cookie. So right now we have to make the vanilla sugar, and we have to make the glaze that's going to go on top of the cookies. And as I'd said before, if this were the actual Stollen bread, I would have vanilla beans that were sliced in half, sitting in sugar for months on end, wrapped up tight, so that way they could just infuse the aroma and the flavor from there. We're not doing that. We're doing something you can eat today. So we're just literally going to take some vanilla extract, and we're going to put it into some sugar, which looks ridiculous, because it just gives you a nice little clump of vanilla sugar right there. We're going to actually kind of work that into the rest of the sugar. Typically, the best thing to do with this is if you did it the day before, because it's going to be a little bit tacky this first day. If you did it the day before, it would actually dry out and be easier to stick on. It would be less clumpy. But you can still do it the day of. The other great thing about this cookie, I'm not going to lie to, is just like the Stollen bread, although it's okay when it comes out of the oven, the next day the flavors all develop because it's so complex, and it's amazing. It gives you the feel of like a ginger snap, but it's not a ginger snap at all. It doesn't even taste like a ginger snap. Like, you get confused. Your mouth will get a little confused when it's eating it, which is cool. I like confused mouthfeel for stuff. If I eat something and I don't know what it is, I'm going to sit there and like try to analyze it, and I need to take another bite. That's what this is. This is one of those things where you have to have another bite. You can't just let it go because you want to know what you're eating, right? So we've got our vanilla sugar, we're gonna set that aside. Now we have to make our glaze, and I don't like to waste any of the butters because again, butter's awesome for Stollen and for these cookies. So we're gonna take the leftover melted butter we have and toss that into a bowl. We're gonna put a little rum extract in there. We're gonna add some powdered sugar. We're basically making a very simple, like a water-based simple glaze. We just happen to add butter and rum flavor to it, and a little bit of water. And we're gonna whisk that up till it's a good consistency. And I don't have measurements for this because it all depends on how much you want. I didn't put enough powdered sugar in there, so I add a little more. You could actually take the same rum glaze and you have leftovers, drizzle it over your pancakes, your waffles in the morning. It's amazing. Instead of using that corn syrup-based maple syrup that you're buying at the store. So you don't really want lumps because they'll just show up on the cookie. But you just want this nice little, it's thin, it's not real thick. It's something that you can spread on with a paintbrush. Or pastry brush in this case. I believe the cookies are just about done. We're going to pull them out, and while they're warm, we're going to go ahead and glaze them because then they're going to soak in a little bit and get that flavor right in the cookie, and it'll help the sugar to actually set to it. So as you can see, it has that beautiful, it kind of looks like a Stollen loaf, but they're much bigger, obviously. These would be like Stollen rolls, but they're not, they're cookies. We're going to go ahead and glaze them while they're still a little warm. And we're going to use the sugar. And again, this sugar, what's great, you don't need the sugar if you didn't really want it, but if you've ever eaten my bread, there's this wonderful crunchiness that you get from the sugar that you don't get if you don't have that sugar. So it gives you an extra mouthfeel that adds to the texture of what you're eating and really sells the point that this is a cookie form of that same bread. You're going to sprinkle a little vanilla sugar on top, which should stick to it, which is what we want. And you're going to enjoy either today or tomorrow or next week or with your friends. That's the wonderful thing about Stollen is I haven't tried it with the cookies yet. They're a fairly new recipe for me, but the bread, traditionally will sometimes be eaten at Easter. Like they'll make it around the holidays and still be eating it around Easter. I think because of all the rum and stuff that's in it, it'll actually help preserve it, much like any other fruitcake. So happy holidays. Thank you for joining us here on Baker Dave Presents. And a special thank you to the German people for creating such a delicious bread that inspired my delicious cookie. Join us again next time on Baker Dave Presents, and remember, every recipe has a story.